He settles into the courtroom with the composed demeanor of an individual convinced his transgressions are impervious to discovery, a charismatic figure whose adherents would never compromise his anonymity. The community found itself gripped by an act so perplexing it defied rational explanation, a homicide seemingly lifted from a macabre, convoluted philosophical narrative, leaving investigators to ponder the full depth of its horror. Yet, the prosecution held a digital key, poised to dismantle his empire of deceit, and everything would shift the moment the judge began to recite his emails aloud. How does a mind become so utterly shattered that it perceives murder not as a wrongful act, but as a sacred right, an indispensable component in a cosmic drama only it can fully grasp? What kind of doctrine can entrench itself so deeply within one's being that it compels others to participate in its violent liturgy, transforming them from individuals into instruments of a malevolent creed? This was the pivotal question that would come to haunt Baltimore, Maryland, a port city marked by stark inequalities, where the glittering edifices of the inner harbor cast elongated shadows over districts grappling with pervasive poverty. It was within one of these unassuming, quiet neighborhoods, a locale of brick row houses and closely knit families, that an act of such profound and ritualistic evil would unfold, shattering the community's sense of security and exposing a burgeoning, unseen darkness within its core. The urgent call to 911 arrived just after 2 o'clock in the morning, a frantic, breathless plea from a neighbor who had discerned something terribly amiss. The voice on the other end recounted a chant, a low and rhythmic sound that had drifted through the humid night air, followed by a singular, piercing shriek that was abruptly silenced. When officers from the Baltimore Police Department reached the modest residence of Ella Palmer, they encountered a scene that would forever be etched into their professional memories. There were no signs of forced entry, no indicators of a robbery gone awry. Instead, the front door was slightly ajar, an implicit invitation into a nightmare meticulously crafted by a deranged artist. Inside, the environment was one of bewildering and terrifying precision, a tableau of violence that was anything but haphazard. Ella Palmer, a 24-year-old barista renowned for her infectious laughter and compassionate nature, was discovered in her living room, her life brutally extinguished. But it was the precise arrangement of the scene that confounded investigators, the chilling nuances that suggested not fury, but ceremony. Peculiar enigmatic symbols were painted on the walls using a substance later identified as a mixture of ash and oil, and a perfect circle of salt had been sprinkled on the floor around her, a grotesque parody of an ancient rite. Her possessions had not been pilfered, but meticulously rearranged into strange configurations, her books stacked in spirals, and her kitchen implements laid out in a precise geometric pattern that held some unfathomable significance. This was not merely a homicide. It was a pronouncement, a performance for an invisible audience, dictated by a logic so alien it felt like a message from another dimension. The initial inquiry stalled almost immediately, as there was no forensic evidence pointing to a suspect, no DNA, no fingerprints, no murder weapon left behind. The detectives assigned to the case, under the leadership of the composed and systematic Detective Joseph Stone, found themselves adrift in a sea of bizarre clues that pointed nowhere. They were cast adrift amidst the stark dichotomies of Baltimore itself, where immense prosperity existed mere blocks from crushing destitution, and where the boundary between order and savagery could dissolve in one horrific night. The city collectively held its breath, gripped by the terror of a killer who not only ended a life but desecrated it, a phantom who operated according to a set of principles that no rational person could ever hope to fathom. Detective Stone and his team spent weeks pursuing phantoms, their investigation feeling more like an exploration into theological horror than conventional police work. They consulted specialists in occultism and fringe religious movements, attempting to decipher the meaning of the symbols discovered at the scene. Yet, each inquiry led to another dead end. The symbols appeared to be a unique creation, a private language of madness known solely to the perpetrator. The sheer abnormality of the crime ignited a media frenzy, with television news and local newspapers broadcasting endless reports on the ritual killer, a designation that only intensified the escalating public panic. The case became a dark mirror held up to the city of Baltimore, reflecting the underlying anxieties that pulse just beneath the surface of its resilient, blue-collar facade. Ella Palmer was mourned by a community that struggled to comprehend her loss. She was a woman who embodied the city's finer qualities, diligent, kind, and imbued with a quiet optimism that now seemed tragically naive. Friends and family remembered her as someone who perceived the good in everyone, a characteristic that investigators feared might have sealed her fate. They pondered if her open-hearted nature had rendered her susceptible to a predator who could pervert such kindness into an opportunity for monstrous evil. The crime had left a profound wound on the neighborhood, a lingering sensation of violation that extended beyond the single life so brutally ended. It was an assault against the very notion of normalcy, a declaration that even in the most mundane of homes, a gateway could open into a realm of unimaginable dread. The detectives worked relentlessly, questioning everyone who knew Ella, from her colleagues at the bustling downtown coffee shop to her childhood friends who still resided in the same close-knit community. Yet every interview yielded the same frustrating outcome. Ella had no adversaries, no clandestine life, no connection to any world where such ritualistic aggression would make sense. She was a beacon of light, and someone had chosen to extinguish that light for reasons that remained locked within the deepest, most inaccessible recesses of a depraved mind. The investigation was stagnating, a collection of curious facts lacking a cohesive narrative. It was during one of these interviews that a name first emerged, a name that seemed inconsequential at the time, but would later prove to be the linchpin of the entire case. A coworker mentioned a man named Mateo Reyes, a customer who had exhibited an unusual preoccupation with Ella over the preceding months. He was described as intensely charismatic, a man capable of captivating a room with his eloquence, speaking with a hypnotic assurance about philosophy, spirituality, and discovering one's authentic path. He possessed an answer for every query, a serene smile that never wavered, and an unsettling faculty for making people feel as if he divined their deepest secrets. The coworker recalled that Ella had been intrigued, yet also slightly discomfited by the sheer intensity of his focus on her. The name was logged, merely one among dozens in a burgeoning file, but it was the initial thread, which, when pulled, would begin to unravel a conspiracy of belief and violence far more terrifying than anyone could have conceived. Mateo Reyes was not merely a customer, he was a prophet of his own dark gospel. And he had designated Ella Palmer as his inaugural sacrifice. The city of Baltimore was about to discover that the most perilous monsters are those who can persuade you they are saviors, the ones who smile as they guide you into the abyss. The name Mateo Reyes propelled Detective Joseph Stone and his team down a labyrinthine path of digital clues and hushed murmurs. He maintained no fixed address, moving between several apartments rented by his adherents, and had no formal employment, seemingly subsisting on the generosity of those who had succumbed to his influence. His online presence was meticulously curated, comprising a series of enigmatic blog posts and videos where he discoursed in dense philosophical terms about transcending the constraints of material reality and attaining a higher state of being through transformative actions. It was all exasperatingly vague, yet possessed a peculiar magnetic allure, and as detectives delved deeper, they unearthed a small but fervently devoted online community that revered Mateo as a guru, a visionary, a man privy to a concealed truth. It was a tip from a former follower, a young woman who had fled the group in terror, that ultimately provided the police with the crucial leverage they needed. She spoke of Mateo's escalating paranoia, his conviction that the world was an illusory prison that necessitated shattering through acts of pure will. She delineated his inner circle, a small group of impressionable young individuals who hung on his every utterance, their identities gradually dissolving, replaced by his own warped ideology. Most significantly, she disclosed the location of Mateo's next sermon, a dilapidated warehouse on the industrial outskirts of Baltimore, a place where the city's forgotten industries gradually corroded, concealed from the dazzling waterfront. Based on her testimony, a warrant was secured, and a tactical unit prepared to intervene. The apprehension of Mateo Reyes was an unsettlingly quiet affair. When the police stormed the warehouse, they did not encounter a man poised for confrontation, but one who seemed to anticipate their arrival, sitting calmly amidst a circle of his 5 most devoted followers. He offered no resistance, a faint, serene smile gracing his lips as the handcuffs were secured around his wrists. It was as if his capture was merely another scene in the grand cosmic drama he orchestrated. He was escorted to an interrogation room at police headquarters, a sterile, windowless cubicle that stood in stark contrast to the expansive philosophical world he claimed to inhabit. Detective Stone sat opposite him, expecting a confession, a denial, or a furious tirade. But what he received was something far more disquieting. Mateo Reyes was a master of psychological manipulation, a puppeteer who treated the interrogation not as an inquiry into a brutal murder, but as a philosophical debate. He never raised his voice, never displayed a flicker of apprehension or anger. Instead of directly answering, he countered every query with a question of his own, twisting the detective's phrasing, subtly altering perceptions of reality, and striving to plant seeds of doubt within the very heart of the investigation. When Stone confronted him with the stark facts surrounding Ella Palmer's murder, Mateo would slowly nod, his expression one of profound empathy, then inquire, "But what truly defines death, detective? Is it a conclusion, or is it merely a transformation? Perhaps what you interpret as a catastrophe, another spirit might perceive as an emancipation." His discourse meandered in maddening circles, his reasoning a slippery, self-contained loop, meticulously crafted to exhaust and bewilder his interrogator. He even attempted to manipulate Detective Stone on a deeply personal level, leveraging intimate details he couldn't conceivably have known, likely harvested from his followers' relentless online delving. "You bear a heavy load, don't you, Joseph?" "Earl," Mateo murmured, his gaze locking onto the detective's, acknowledging the burden of all this ugliness. He continued, "You believe you are imposing order on chaos, but what if chaos is the authentic order, and it is you who are conjuring the illusion of dominion?" He artfully tried to twist the detective's innate sense of duty into a vulnerability, transforming his pursuit of justice into a futile endeavor. It was a chilling display, a calculated effort to psychologically dismantle the individual, striving to hold him accountable for his transgressions. He positioned himself not as a suspect, but as a therapist, present to guide the detective in comprehending the folly of his own perspective. Throughout the multi-hour interrogation, Mateo never once conceded to knowing Ella Palmer, yet he never outright denied it either. He would speak of a magnificent soul he had encountered, one ensnared in the confines of a mundane existence. And he would lament the anguish of witnessing someone with such vast potential for transcendence choose to linger in the confines of the ordinary. He was confessing through metaphors, acknowledging his motive while shrouding it in the rhetoric of spiritual deliverance. He was boasting of his crime in a manner he believed was too intellectually refined for the police to decipher, a confession starkly visible, yet ingeniously concealed. This encapsulated his narcissism, the unwavering conviction that he operated on a plane of existence so profoundly superior to everyone else's that he could openly detail his actions, and they would remain too myopic to grasp it. The psychological warfare was unyielding. Mateo would subtly mirror Detective Stone's body language, a classic manipulative tactic designed to forge a spurious sense of rapport. One moment he would commend the detective's intellect, the next he would condescendingly sigh at his limited purview. He was endeavoring to blanket the interrogation in a fog of cognitive dissonance, a state of disorientation where the detective would begin to question his own discernment. But Detective Stone was a seasoned veteran of 1,000 such encounters. He had witnessed every conceivable variation of monstrosity, from the screaming psychopath to the cold, calculating sociopath. He recognized Mateo's stratagems for what they truly were, the desperate maneuvers of a predator attempting to cling to control, the singular thing that had ever truly mattered to him. As the interrogation progressed, Mateo's serene facade began to exhibit the faintest fissures. His smile would constrict at the edges whenever Detective Stone steadfastly refused to engage with his philosophical musings, instead consistently redirecting the discussion back to the harsh, grim realities of the case. The enigmatic symbols on the wall, the precise circle of salt, the life of Ella Palmer violently extinguished. Each time Stone uttered Ella's name, a flicker of something, perhaps annoyance, or even fury would momentarily flash in Mateo's eyes before being meticulously suppressed. He perceived Ella not as a human being, but as a mere symbol, an instrument for his own self-aggrandizement. and the detective's insistence on humanizing her constituted a direct assault on his meticulously constructed narrative. Ultimately, Matteo legally confessed to nothing. He endorsed no documents, made no explicit admissions, yet, within that room, through his calculated evasions and his arrogant psychological games, he had laid bare the very core of his depravity. He was a man who genuinely believed he possessed the right to edit the lives of others, to determine who was worthy of transcendence and who was not. He viewed himself as a deity in his own minuscule, pitiful universe, and Ella Palmer had become his inaugural human sacrifice. As he was escorted from the interrogation room to a holding cell, Matteo Reyes maintained his smile, implicitly convinced that he had triumphed in the intellectual contest, that he had unequivocally proven himself to be the most astute person present. He was a charismatic leader who had successfully distorted reality for his followers, and he harbored no doubt that he could achieve the same with a jury, thinking no one could fathom the true depths of his monstrous vanity. He was mistaken. With Matteo Reyes now in custody, the investigation's focus pivoted to his inner circle. The 5 followers apprehended with him in the warehouse represented a collection of lost souls, young, impressionable, and desperate for the sense of purpose and belonging that Matteo had so skillfully offered them. They were a cross-section of Baltimore's neglected youth, encompassing individuals from both the city's struggling districts and its affluent but emotionally barren suburbs, all unified by a shared vulnerability that Matteo had expertly exploited. Initially, they presented an impenetrable wall of silence, reiterating Matteo's cryptic phrases and philosophical evasions with the rehearsed precision of brainwashed acolytes. They spoke of their leader with a reverence bordering on worship, their allegiance seemingly unshakable. Prosecutor Scarlett Howard, a sharp and tenacious lawyer renowned for dismantling intricate criminal organizations, understood that penetrating this wall of devotion was paramount to the case. She grasped that Matteo's influence stemmed not from physical prowess, but from psychological manipulation, and she needed to sever that bond. The followers were segregated and detained in different facilities, cut off from Matteo and from one another, an isolation strategically designed to compel them to confront the stark reality of their situation without the reinforcing echo of the group's collective delusion. Slowly, painstakingly, the prosecution team began their work, not with threats, but with a steady drip of reality. The first breakthrough emerged from the youngest of the followers, a 19-year-old who had been estranged from his family for over a year. After days of isolation, confronted with photographs of the life he had abandoned and the horrifying crime scene images from Ella Palmer's residence, his resolve began to crumble. He provided a meticulous account of the group's ideology, describing how Matteo had gradually convinced them that societal laws were an illusion and that they were enlightened beings destined to usher in a new era of consciousness. He explained that Ella Palmer had been targeted because Matteo perceived her as a symbol of the beautiful but ignorant soul, and that her liberation was intended as a message to the world, the inaugural act in their grand rebellion against reality itself. His testimony was a pivotal breakthrough, but the physical evidence remained circumstantial. That changed dramatically when the forensics lab returned with a surprising discovery. While the main crime scene had been meticulously sanitized, analysis of trace evidence found on the clothing of the followers revealed something crucial: microscopic glass fragments and a unique blend of industrial solvents embedded within the fibers of their shoes, substances that did not correspond to the warehouse where they were arrested. Detective Stone, acting on a hunch, directed his team to conduct an analysis of industrial sites across Baltimore, searching for a location that specifically utilized this particular combination of materials. The search led them to an abandoned chemical plant on the city's derelict waterfront, a place characterized by decaying brick and shattered windows. Inside the plant, investigators uncovered a secondary scene, clearly serving as the group's sanctuary and rehearsal space. The identical bizarre symbols found in Ella Palmer's apartment adorned the crumbling walls, and a large circle of salt was etched into the grimy concrete floor. This was where they had practiced their rituals, where Matteo had indoctrinated his philosophy into their minds until it became their own. But the most significant revelation resided in a locked back room. Forensic evidence, including hair and fiber samples, conclusively proved that this was where the murder had actually been planned, and, crucially, that one of the followers had been present with Mateo. This finding was a bombshell. Mateo Reyes had not acted alone. He had an accomplice, a partner who had assisted him in executing the most sadistic aspects of his plan. This revelation ignited a fresh wave of fear throughout the city. Not only was a charismatic cult leader behind bars, but a second monster, one of his devoted disciples, remained at large, potentially poised to kill again to reaffirm their loyalty. The focus of the investigation sharpened instantly. The 5 followers were reinterrogated, this time with the irrefutable evidence that one of them was lying. The pressure within the group, already strained by isolation, now became unbearable. The bond of trust that Mateo had so meticulously constructed shattered into suspicion and fear, as each follower eyed the others as a potential betrayer, and more horrifyingly, as a fellow murderer. Prosecutor Howard capitalized on this new evidence to offer a deal to the followers. The first one to identify the accomplice and provide testimony against Mateo would receive a significantly reduced sentence. It was a classic legal maneuver designed to turn the co-conspirators against each other, and it worked with brutal efficiency. The once unbreakable wall of silence crumbled into a desperate race to confess. 2 more followers broke, their accounts corroborating the first, each adding new layers of detail about Mateo's manipulative tactics and his bizarre apocalyptic philosophy. They all pointed to the same individual as the accomplice, the quietest and most devoted member of the inner circle, a 20-year-old woman who had viewed Mateo not merely as a leader, but as a messiah. The absent accomplice remained at large, vanishing swiftly after the arrests. This prompted a citywide manhunt, her image now dominating every news broadcast in Baltimore. The quest to find her transformed into a frantic race against time, intensified by fears of her next move. Was she in hiding, or meticulously planning another profound act to honor her incarcerated leader? What began as a search for a lone killer had morphed into an intricate conspiracy, revealing a festering pocket of delusion within the city's core. The public's perception of these seemingly lost youths starkly contrasted with the horrific truth of their deeds, a truly jarring realization. They weren't merely misguided individuals, but the zealous foot soldiers in a holy war instigated by a self-absorbed prophet, with Baltimore serving as their battleground. The hunt for the missing accomplice intensified, as the prosecution understood that her capture and subsequent testimony would deliver the definitive blow to Mateo Reyes's case. As Mateo Reyes's pretrial hearings commenced, a strange and unsettling phenomenon unfolded outside the Baltimore City Circuit Courthouse. Each day, a small contingent of young people, none from the original inner circle, began to coalesce on the courthouse steps. Clad in black, their pale faces serious, they clutched signs displaying Mateo's cryptic symbols and slogans such as, "The seeker is innocent and free the messenger." Against the imposing backdrop of the stately courthouse, they presented an odd and disquieting spectacle, a new generation of adherents drawn to Mateo's dark allure through his digital legacy. They were his nascent fan club, undeniable proof of his manipulative doctrines' enduring power. Inside the courtroom, Mateo seemed to draw strength from their presence. He had shed the serene, philosophical gaslighter persona from the interrogation room, now embodying a performer, playing to the gallery and the ever-present news cameras. He entered the courtroom daily with a confident smirk, acknowledging his supporters like a rock star taking the stage. He treated the legal proceedings with theatrical disdain, sighing audibly during the prosecution's motions and occasionally scoffing under his breath at the judge's rulings. His court-appointed defense attorney, Charles Warren, appeared increasingly exasperated, his client's arrogance making his task almost impossible. Over the ensuing weeks, the fan club outside grew in size and vociferousness. They established a camp on the plaza, forming a self-contained community of devotees who viewed Mateo not as a murderer, but as a political prisoner, a visionary persecuted by a system wary of his truth. They granted interviews to any media outlet willing to listen, extolling Mateo in glowing terms and echoing the same nonsensical philosophy he had espoused online. They became an integral part of the trial's daily circus, their misguided devotion a constant, infuriating sideshow to the grave business of justice. Mateo's family, a wealthy and influential dynasty with deep roots in Baltimore's business community, made no effort to deter them. Indeed, whispers circulated that they were secretly funding the group, hoping to cultivate a narrative of public support that might sway the jury pool. This alliance between Mateo's affluent family and his motley crew of disaffected followers perfectly mirrored Baltimore itself, a city of stark contrasts where the powerful and the disenfranchised could find common ground in perpetuating a monstrous falsehood. The family's strategy was unambiguous: leverage their influence and resources to create an atmosphere of chaos and doubt around the case. They launched a vicious smear campaign against Ella Palmer, leaking fabricated stories to tabloid websites that painted her as a troubled young woman involved in perilous activities. It was a vile attempt to posthumously blame the victim, suggesting she was somehow culpable for the bizarre ritual that had ended her life. Mateo's courtroom demeanor grew increasingly brazen with each hearing. He would sketch symbols he had left at the crime scene onto a legal pad, not taking notes on the case, occasionally holding them up for his followers in the gallery to see. It was a silent, arrogant communication, a way of reminding them of the sacred act he had committed, and solidifying his status as their leader. During a particularly contentious hearing concerning the admissibility of his online writings, Mateo was caught on a courtroom hot mic whispering to his lawyer, "They are like children playing with fire, Charles. They have no idea of the power they are trying to contain." It was a moment of pure, unadulterated narcissism, a glimpse into the mind of a man who believed he was a deity trapped within a mortal legal system. The fan club's presence began to exert a palpable, corrosive effect on the proceedings. Prosecution witnesses reported harassment and intimidation en route to the courthouse. Jurors selected for the trial had to be escorted by bailiffs through a daily gauntlet of chanting and insults. The entire process was being contaminated by Mateo's cult of personality, which continued to operate and even grow while its leader remained incarcerated. Prosecutor Scarlett Howard vehemently argued for measures to quell the circus outside, yet the group meticulously stayed within legal boundaries, their protests technically protected as free speech. It was a frustrating and infuriating predicament, a perversion of the very rights the justice system was designed to uphold. The facade of remorse most defendants wear in court, the feigned humility and respect for the process, was utterly absent in Mateo Reyes. Instead, he wore a mask of contempt, of amusement, of a man so convinced of his intellectual and spiritual superiority that the entire trial was merely a minor inconvenience on his path to greatness. He wasn't merely fighting for his freedom. He was fighting to prove that his worldview was more potent than society's laws. His followers believed him, and their presence provided him with a constant supply of narcissistic validation, fueling his arrogance and defiance. The trial had yet to begin, but the battle lines were already sharply drawn. On one side stood the rule of law and the pursuit of justice for Ella Palmer. On the other, a charismatic monster and the small, tragic army of believers he had corrupted, all playing their part in a theater of the absurd on the steps of the Baltimore courthouse. The opening day of Mateo Reyes' trial was a media spectacle unlike any Baltimore had witnessed in years. The courthouse plaza descended into chaos, with Mateo's black-clad followers on one side, their faces a mixture of defiant anger and serene devotion, and on the other, a crowd of counter-protesters brandishing signs with Ella Palmer's smiling face, demanding justice. It was the city's profound contrasts writ large, a clash between the forces of reason and the seductive allure of a madman's fantasy. Inside, the courtroom was at maximum capacity, a tense electric silence hanging in the air as everyone awaited the defendant's entrance. When Mateo Reyes was escorted into the courtroom, a collective gasp rippled through the gallery. As he passed the section where his followers were seated, they rose as one and gave him a standing ovation. Their applause was not loud, but a slow, rhythmic beat, a gesture of solemn, cult-like reverence that was profoundly disturbing. The judge's gavel slammed down. Bailiffs moved in to restore order, but the message had been unequivocally delivered. This was not merely the trial of a man, but of a movement, and its leader had just received a hero's welcome. Mateo basked in the adoration, a beatific smile gracing his face before he took his seat at the defense table, the epitome of a prophet among his flock. Prosecutor Scarlett Howard began her opening statement with a quiet, yet devastating power. She did not immediately delve into the crime's details, but instead projected a life-size photograph of Ella Palmer onto a large screen for the jury to see. It was a picture of Ella on a sunny day at the Baltimore harbor, laughing, her face radiating life and promise. "This was Ella Palmer," Howard began, her voice steady and clear. "She was not a symbol. She was not a sacrifice. She was a daughter, a friend, a beloved member of this community. And she is the reason we are here today." She systematically dismantled the myth of Mateo Reyes, portraying him not as a misunderstood visionary, but as a parasitic narcissist who preyed on the vulnerable and demanded the ultimate price for his own self-glorification. In stark contrast, the defense's opening statement was a masterclass in obfuscation and victim blaming. Charles Warren, looking deeply uncomfortable with the argument his client was compelling him to make, depicted Mateo as a gentle spiritual guide who had been tragically misunderstood. He then pivoted to an outrageous assault on Ella Palmer's character, repeating the lies Mateo's family had been disseminating online. He suggested that Ella was a deeply troubled young woman who had sought Mateo out, and that her death was not murder, but a tragic accident that occurred during a spiritual cleansing she had begged him to perform. It was a disgusting narrative, one that caused Ella's parents to sob openly in the front row. The prosecution's first witness was the co-worker who had initially mentioned Mateo's name to the police. She described his unnerving charisma, the way he would hold court at the coffee shop, captivating customers with his hypnotic voice and confident pronouncements. She recounted how his attention had fixated on Ella, how he had showered her with compliments that felt more like assessments, as if he were evaluating her for some sinister purpose. Her testimony established Mateo's initial connection to the victim and the predatory nature of his interest. During her testimony, Mateo observed her with an air of condescending pity, occasionally shaking his head almost imperceptibly, as if dismayed by her inability to grasp a deeper understanding. The day's most dramatic moment arrived with the playback of the 911 call for the jury. A profound silence descended upon the courtroom, punctuated only by Ella's neighbor's frantic voice recounting the unsettling, rhythmic chanting that had preceded the scream. As the recording echoed, several jurors visibly recoiled, their faces paling at the raw, unfiltered terror conveyed in the neighbor's tone. Throughout the call's duration, Mateo Reyes remained perfectly still, his eyes shut and a faint, serene smile gracing his lips, as if he were captivated by a beautiful melody. This was a moment of such profound and chilling malevolence that it seemed to draw all the air from the room. He was not merely a killer, he was a man who savored the recollection of his own monstrous acts. As the first day of the trial concluded, it became undeniably clear that this would be a clash of conflicting narratives. The prosecution meticulously constructed a case built upon irrefutable facts, compelling evidence, and the universal tragedy of a young woman's prematurely ended life. The defense, swayed by its sociopathic client, attempted to fabricate an alternative reality, a world of spiritual emancipation and unfortunate mishaps, where murder was reframed as a therapeutic act. As Mateo was escorted from the courtroom, his adherents once again rose, this time in hushed reverence, their hands placed over their hearts in a symbolic gesture of unity. The city of Baltimore, a port known for its stark contrasts, had become the stage for a trial that would pit the mundane reality of justice against the terrifying allure of a cult leader's deadly charisma. The jury had witnessed the initial act, and now faced the daunting task of deciding which reality they would embrace. The second week of the trial was entirely devoted to the prosecution's evidence, a methodical and relentless presentation of facts meticulously crafted to dismantle Mateo Reyes's messianic facade and reveal the monstrous figure lurking beneath. Prosecutor Scarlett Howard summoned a series of forensic experts who testified about the trace evidence discovered at the abandoned chemical plant, directly linking Mateo's followers to the initial planning stages of the murder. However, the most impactful evidence emanated not from a scientist, but from the victim herself, who addressed the jury from beyond the grave through the intimate pages of her private journal. A detective recounted finding a concealed diary within a false bottom drawer in Ella Palmer's bedroom. It was a small leather-bound book, and as the detective read selected passages aloud, the courtroom was gripped in silent attention. Ella's own words painted a poignant portrait of a young woman simultaneously captivated and deeply unnerved by Mateo Reyes. She documented his intellect and his mesmerizing way of speaking, yet also expressed a growing sense of unease, a feeling that his philosophy was not about liberation, but about absolute control. He talks about breaking chains, she penned in one entry, but it feels more like he's forging new ones that all lead back to him. He says he wants to set my soul free, but I think he just wants to own it. The diary entries darkened as they chronicled the weeks leading up to her demise. She described Mateo's escalating insistence that she join his inner circle, his frustration with her attachment to illusions like her family and her job. The final entry, written merely 2 days before she was slain, served as a chilling premonition of her own end. He told me today that some souls are so beautiful they have to be shattered to release their light, she wrote. He smiled when he said it, but his eyes were like 2 black stones. I'm afraid. I think I need to tell someone about him. A wave of sorrow swept through the courtroom as these final words hung in the air, a desperate plea for help that arrived tragically late. The emotional weight of the diary was followed by the stark, undeniable data of digital forensics. An expert from the Baltimore Police Department's Cyber Crimes Unit took the stand, meticulously detailing the contents of Mateo's laptop and phone. His search history was a clear roadmap of his malevolent intentions, containing queries for ancient purification rituals, the symbolic significance of salt and exorcism, and painless ways to sever the soul from the body. He had bookmarked articles on charismatic cult leaders and downloaded documentaries about Charles Manson, meticulously studying the tactics of the monsters who had preceded him. It offered a digital window into a mind obsessed with control, power, and the macabre aesthetics of murder. Yet, the most damning evidence, the evidence that directly addressed the headline-grabbing narrative, was a series of emails. These were not emails written by Mateo, but to him from his now fugitive accomplice. The prosecution had successfully tracked her to a small town in another state, and in exchange for a plea deal, she had divulged everything. She not only confessed her role in the crime, but also provided access to a secret email account she had used to communicate with Mateo. As Prosecutor Howard displayed the emails on the large screen for the jury, the final pieces of the macabre puzzle clicked into place. The emails unveiled a horrifying dialogue of premeditation. The accomplice wrote to Mateo with fawning adoration, seeking his approval for every intricate detail of the planned ritual. "My teacher," one email began, "I have procured the oils and the ash as you instructed. The symbols will be perfect. Her liberation will be a work of art, a testament to your wisdom." Mateo's replies were those of a director meticulously guiding his lead actress, filled with praise for her devotion and explicit instructions for the ceremony. "Remember, the act must be pure," he wrote back. "There can be no anger, only love. We are not destroying a life. We are releasing an energy. She will thank us when she reaches the other side." Reading these emails felt like eavesdropping on the architects of a nightmare. They discussed Ella Palmer with terrifying detachment, referring to her as the vessel or the subject. They meticulously planned every detail, from the precise time of the ceremony to the bizarre arrangement of her belongings, all designed to fulfill the tenets of Mateo's sick and twisted philosophy. These emails unequivocally proved that Ella's murder was not a spontaneous act, but a cold, calculated, and meticulously rehearsed performance. They were the ultimate proof of his corruption of a young, impressionable follower, transforming her into an instrument of his malevolent will. As the contents of the emails were read aloud, Mateo's mask of serene superiority finally fractured. For the very first time, a look of pure, unadulterated rage flashed across his face. He had been betrayed by his most loyal disciple, his secret gospel laid bare for the mundane world to scrutinize. He glared at his defense attorney as if it were his fault, then turned his venomous gaze on the jury, his eyes burning with a hatred far more revealing than any confession. In that pivotal moment, he was not a prophet or a teacher. He was simply a common killer, his perceived specialness exposed as a fraud, his power over his followers shattered by the simple, undeniable truth of his own written words. The emails had utterly demolished his narrative, and as he sat there, exposed and simmering with fury, he was no longer contemplating transcendence. He was thinking only of revenge. The defense case for Mateo Reyes unfolded as a desperate and chaotic spectacle, entirely dictated by the capricious whims of a narcissistic defendant who firmly believed he was his own most effective advocate. Despite the strenuous and repeated advice of his lawyer, Charles Warren, Mateo adamantly insisted on constructing his defense around a bizarre and patently absurd claim that he suffered from dissociative identity disorder and that Ella Palmer's murder had been committed by a violent, rogue alter ego he could not control. It was a strategy born of pure arrogance, a conviction that he was intelligent enough to outwit not only the jury, but the entire field of psychiatric medicine. Charles Warren called a single expert witness to the stand, a disgraced psychiatrist who had lost his license in 2 states and now earned a living as a hired gun for desperate defense teams. The psychiatrist testified that he had spent several hours with Mateo and had concluded that he was a classic case of multiple personalities. He described an alleged alter ego named Cain, a dark and ancient entity that supposedly emerged to cleanse the world of spiritual impurity. The testimony was so replete with jargon and theatrical pronouncements that it felt less like a medical diagnosis and more like a scene from a low-budget horror movie. The jury listened with expressions of open skepticism. Prosecutor Scarlett Howard's cross-examination was a masterclass in surgical destruction. She did not initially attack the disgraced psychiatrist's credentials directly. Instead, she asked him to describe the process by which he had arrived at his diagnosis. The psychiatrist puffed out his chest and expounded upon his intuitive clinical insights and his ability to perceive the fractured energies of the human soul. Howard allowed him to speak, letting him thoroughly entangle himself in his own pseudoscientific nonsense. Then she moved in for the kill. "Doctor," she asked, her voice dripping with polite incredulity, "are you aware that your client's internet search history in the month before the murder included phrases like how to fake multiple personality disorder, famous court cases involving DID, and symptoms of dissociative identity disorder that convinced juries?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The psychiatrist's face blanched. He stammered that he had not been privy to that information. Howard continued, "And are you aware that your client downloaded 3 books on the subject, including a well-known actor's guide to portraying characters with mental illness?" The psychiatrist was speechless. His credibility, already paper-thin, had been utterly shredded. The defense lay in ruins, but Mateo Reyes was far from finished. In a culminating display of arrogance, he insisted on testifying himself. Charles Warren implored him to reconsider, but Mateo remained steadfast, convinced that once the jury heard his narrative directly from him, his charisma would undeniably sway their judgment. This proved to be a disastrous miscalculation. On the stand, Mateo's performance was an unconvincing display of poor acting and transparent falsehoods. He attempted to embody his alter ego, Cain, shutting his eyes, grimacing, then speaking in a slightly deeper, gravelly tone. The portrayal was so unpersuasive and offensively dramatic that several jury members struggled to stifle their smiles. During his direct examination, he wove a fantastical tale of being a captive within his own physique, a gentle spirit tormented by the malevolent entity sharing his form. He professed his affection for Ella Palmer, asserting he had striven to safeguard her from Cain's righteous wrath. He shed insincere tears, a revolting show of contrition as hollow as his philosophical tenets. He wasn't merely fabricating, he was audaciously insulting the intelligence of everyone present, confident that his manipulative prowess was so profound he could compel them to embrace the impossible. Scarlett Howard's cross-examination was incisive and systematic. She refused to engage with his charade, deliberately ignoring Cain's alleged existence. She addressed him solely as Mateo Reyes, the calculating assassin, meticulously dismantling his testimony with cold, unyielding facts. She reintroduced the emails, making him verbally deliver his own words, his own instructions for the murder, to the jury. "Was it you, Mr. Reyes, or was it Cain, who penned the directive that the vessel's liberation must be beautiful, a work of art?" she demanded. Flustered, Mateo claimed no recollection of composing the emails, attributing control to Cain. The pivotal moment arrived when Howard confronted him with a detail from his accomplice's confession. "Mr. Reyes," she stated, Your associate testified that after the murder, you turned to her and remarked, "Now, that was a masterpiece." Did Cain utter that, or did you? Mateo froze, unprepared for this specific detail, a fissure in his meticulously constructed narrative. He stammered, contradicted himself, and his entire facade of control disintegrated. The magnetic prophet vanished, replaced by a panicking, cornered deceiver. The jury perceived him not as a man with a fragmented psyche, but as a charlatan, a manipulative actor whose ultimate performance had utterly failed. His decision to testify had been the final, arrogant nail in his legal coffin. He had deliberately lied in court, assuming his deception would remain secret, but ultimately, he had exposed himself more completely than any witness possibly could. The victim impact statement served as the emotional apex of the trial, a raw and agonizing counterpoint to Mateo Reyes's calculated deceptions and psychological maneuvers. One by one, Ella Palmer's family and friends took the stand, articulating the profound void left by her absence. Their words painted a vivid panorama of a life brimming with kindness, laughter, and an unassuming grace. Her mother, her voice choked with tears, reminisced about Ella's childhood, her deep affection for Baltimore, and her aspiration to one day open her own small bakery in one of its historic districts. She spoke of the simple, irreplaceable delight of hearing her daughter's voice on the telephone, a joy now reduced to a memory. Ella's father, a stoic, industrious man who had dedicated his life to working on Baltimore's docks, did not weep. His voice was thick with a grief so profound it had transcended tears, hardening into a cold, fierce anger. He bypassed addressing the judge or jury, instead turning in the witness stand to speak directly to Mateo Reyes, his gaze fixed on the man who had murdered his only child. "You took my daughter," he declared, his voice low and quivering with controlled fury. "You snatched her from me, from her mother, from everyone who cherished her. You speak of souls and liberation, but you are merely a parasite feeding on the goodness of others. I pray you spend the remainder of your wretched life in a cage, contemplating what you did to my little girl." Throughout these heart-wrenching declarations, Mateo Reyes maintained an unsettling composure, a picture of serene detachment. He avoided the gaze of the grieving parents, betraying no flicker of emotion. Instead, he idly sketched his cryptic symbols on his legal pad, occasionally casting a glance at his followers in the gallery, a shared look of superior understanding passing between them. He signaled to them that this display of raw human suffering was beneath him, a mundane drama of the unenlightened that could not penetrate his elevated spirit. This act of staggering contempt, this profound disrespect for the family's anguish, ignited a palpable sense of outrage throughout the courtroom. The breaking point, the moment that would be incessantly replayed on news channels for weeks, occurred during the final statement from Ella's closest friend. As she tearfully recounted a future that would remain unrealized, the weddings they would never attend as bridesmaids, the children they would never witness growing up, her voice fractured with sobs. In a final shocking act of narcissistic delusion, Mateo Reyes decided to speak. He slowly rose, disregarding his lawyer's frantic whispers, and addressed the victim's family. "I want you to understand," he uttered, his voice soft and laden with false sincerity, "that I forgive you for your anger. You are ensnared in a world of illusion and cannot perceive the magnificent gift I have bestowed upon Ella's soul. One day, you will comprehend, and you will express your gratitude." The courtroom erupted. A surge of shock and fury swept through the gallery. Ella's father lunged over the railing, restrained by bailiffs as he hurled curses at the man, who was not only unrepentant, but actively tormented his family with a grotesque display of magnanimity. The judge slammed her gavel, her face a mask of cold fury, ordering the jury to be removed from the courtroom. The scene devolved into chaos, a perfect reflection of the moral anarchy Mateo Reyes had unleashed. He had exploited their grief, attempting to transform it into a prop in his own psychodrama, a final sadistic twist of the knife. His statement served as a confession of his own soullessness, revealing more than any piece of evidence the true nature of his evil. He was a man utterly devoid of empathy, a black hole of narcissism who viewed others not as human beings, but as instruments for his own spiritual and psychological gratification. His forgiveness was the ultimate act of contempt, an assertion of his godlike supremacy over the very people whose lives he had shattered. He had absorbed their pain and reflected it back at them, twisted into a sickening parody of grace. The jury was eventually brought back in, their expressions grim and resolute. Though they hadn't witnessed Matteo's final monstrous declaration, the repercussions of his outburst were undeniable. The atmosphere in the room had shifted irrevocably. Any lingering doubt, any possibility of perceiving Matteo as merely misguided or mentally unwell, had been eradicated. They had been shown the monster's true visage, a face that smiled with pity as it systematically dismantled everything good and decent in its path. The trial was effectively over. All that remained was the verdict, and a final revelation poised to explain the origins of such a profound and unshakable malevolence. The prosecution's final witness came as a surprise, her name conspicuously absent from any pre-trial witness lists. When Scarlett Howard called her to the stand, a wave of confusion rippled through the courtroom, most notably impacting the defense table, where Matteo Reyes's confident smirk was replaced by a look of genuine shock. The witness was an unassuming middle-aged woman, her face etched with a lifetime of quiet sorrow. She was identified as Matteo's aunt, his mother's sister. What she was about to disclose would provide the final, horrifying key to unraveling how a man could transform into such a monster. She began her testimony by detailing Matteo's childhood, not a home marked by abuse or neglect, but one enveloped in a strange, almost suffocating adoration. His mother, she elucidated, was a woman consumed by fringe spiritualism and the occult, a commanding and domineering figure in her own right, who had perceived her son not as a child, but as a prophecy. From an early age, Matteo had been instilled with the belief that he was special, a chosen one endowed with a unique connection to the spiritual realm. His mother had filled his mind with her peculiar, home-brewed philosophy, a chaotic amalgamation of New Age beliefs, misinterpreted Eastern mysticism, and dark, apocalyptic fantasies. She had raised him in a world devoid of consequences, where his every whim was deemed a divine impulse, and his every selfish act a testament to his spiritual superiority. The aunt depicted a household that resembled less a home and more a cult of two. His mother had deliberately isolated him from other children, homeschooling him and shielding him from a world she deemed corrupt and unenlightened. She wasn't merely an enabler, she was the architect of his narcissism, the high priestess who had crowned her son a deity. As Matteo transitioned into adolescence, his mother's teachings grew darker. She began to expound upon the necessity of transformative acts to shatter the illusions of the material world, a philosophy that furnished the intellectual framework for the violence that was to come. The symbols Matteo employed in his rituals were not ancient signs, but symbols his mother herself had devised, doodles in her journals that she had convinced her son were divine messages from a higher plane. The most electrifying disclosure arose when the prosecutor inquired about Ella Palmer. The aunt testified that Matteo's mother had known Ella's family for years, harboring a quiet, simmering resentment, stemming from a long-forgotten business dispute with Ella's father. Ella, in her apparent contentment, epitomized the cheerful, ordinary existence that filled her with such disdain, a reflection of the mundane world with which she waged an internal war. As the aunt's testimony revealed, it was Matteo's mother who initially pointed Ella out to her son. She had introduced the young woman to him as the ideal subject for his inaugural masterpiece, the perfect vessel for the ritual designed to proclaim his divine essence to the world. Therefore, the atrocity was not solely Matteo's. It was a conspiracy birthed from two distorted psyches, a mother who had shaped her son into a lethal instrument, and a son who had chillingly embodied her darkest fantasies. The ultimate twist materialized when the prosecutor presented a series of emails, not from Matteo, but from his mother, dispatched to her sister in the months preceding the murder. Within these communications, she boasted of her son's spiritual evolution and graphically detailed the liberation he was orchestrating. "He is ready," one email declared. "He will soon execute the act that will shatter the illusion and announce his arrival. The vessel has been chosen. Her name is Ella." A profound silence descended upon the courtroom. Matteo Reyes stared at his aunt on the witness stand, his face a canvas of betrayal and disbelief. His followers in the gallery appeared lost and bewildered, their prophet exposed not as a master of the universe, but as a marionette whose strings were manipulated by his own mother. The very bedrock of his identity, His conviction in his unique brilliance and divine mandate had been a fabrication, a narrative penned by the very individual who should have safeguarded him. He was no messiah. He was a tragic instance of Munchausen by proxy of the soul, his mother inducing delusions of grandeur so she could bask in the reflected splendor of his purported divinity. The testimony furnished the critical missing piece of context for the crime. It elucidated the bizarre rituals, the unyielding arrogance, and the horrifying absence of empathy. Mateo Reyes was not born a monster. He had been meticulously molded into one. His mother had corrupted her own son, transforming him into a tool for her own grievances and her twisted apocalyptic ideology. This revelation served as a devastating indictment not merely of Mateo, but of the lifelong enabler who had steered him onto his murderous trajectory. The jury now grasped the full, horrifying tableau, a narrative of psychological manipulation that had spanned an entire lifetime and culminated in the ritualistic slaughter of an innocent young woman. The enigma was finally unraveled, not by a fingerprint or a DNA match, but by the quiet, shattering testimony of a woman who could no longer remain silent. The jury's verdict was swift and unequivocal. They found Mateo Reyes guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, conspiracy, and kidnapping. As the foreman read the verdict, Mateo's followers let out a collective, sorrowful cry, their world crumbling around them. Mateo himself displayed no emotion, his face an impassive mask of indifference, but the arrogant smirk had vanished, supplanted by a hollow, vacant stare. He had been so convinced of his own ability to bend reality that the simple, irrefutable truth of the verdict seemed to be something he could not fully process. He was no longer a prophet. He was merely another convicted felon in a city of stark contradictions, a product of the very world he claimed to transcend. At the sentencing hearing, the courtroom was once again packed, the atmosphere heavy with anticipation. Ella Palmer's family delivered their final impact statements. Their words now aimed not at the remorseless killer, but at the memory of the daughter they had lost. They spoke of the enduring agony, the irreplaceable void in their lives. Yet, they also spoke of Ella's radiance, of the kindness and affection she had brought into the world, a light that no amount of darkness could ever truly extinguish. Mateo listened to their words with the same detached disinterest he had exhibited throughout the trial, his soul seemingly untouched by the profound grief he had inflicted. When his turn came to speak, he chose not to, simply shaking his head with a faint, weary sigh, the final pathetic gesture of a man who still believed himself persecuted. The sentencing itself, however, would hold one last shocking surprise. Judge Victoria Cunningham, a jurist renowned for her stern demeanor and unwavering adherence to the law, cast her gaze from the bench, bypassing Mateo and settling on his mother, who sat in the front row. "Before I sentence the defendant," the judge declared, her voice resonating with cold authority, "the state has one final motion to address." Prosecutor Scarlett Howard rose and, in a move that stunned the entire courtroom, announced that she was filing charges against Mateo's mother for conspiracy to commit murder and solicitation. The mother let out a constricted gasp, her face contorting into a mask of disbelief and outrage. As bailiffs moved to take her into custody, she erupted in a furious tirade, screaming that they were fools, that they could not halt the prophecy that her son was a god. It was a final, horrifying glimpse into the madness that had initiated it all, the source of the poison that had corrupted a young man and ended an innocent life. As she was dragged from the courtroom, still screaming her bizarre gospel, her son watched her depart, his expression unreadable. Was it betrayal, confusion, or was it the dawning terror of a man realizing that his entire existence had been a lie, a mere instrument for someone else's insanity? With the mother removed, Judge Cunningham directed her full attention to Mateo Reyes. She did not deliver a scorching condemnation of his soul, nor did she raise her voice. Instead, she spoke with a quiet, icy fury that was far more terrifying. "Mr. Reyes," she articulated, "you are a hollow man. You speak of philosophy, but you possess no wisdom. You speak of liberation, but you create only cages. You are a construct of another's madness, a puppet who convinced himself he was a king." She then sentenced him to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, the maximum sentence permitted under Maryland law. In a final, astonishing move that underscored the depth of her revulsion, Judge Cunningham also ordered that the lead detective in the case, Joseph Stone, be charged with obstruction of justice. The courtroom gasped. The judge elaborated that evidence had emerged revealing Stone had a personal relationship with Mateo's family and had deliberately ignored early warnings about his cult, thereby allowing the tragedy to unfold. Two individuals were now being held accountable, the monster and the enabler within the system, who had deliberately looked the other way. This was justice for the enablers, a powerful declaration that the systemic decay would be excised alongside the criminals it allowed to flourish. The verdict sent shockwaves through the Baltimore legal community, a city already characterized by its deep and troubling disparities. The case of Mateo Reyes was finally concluded, but its legacy, a narrative of a mother who forged a monster, a son who became a killer, and a system that failed to intervene, would haunt the city for years to come.